Welcome to In Studio from Simply Timeless. I'm Jay Daniels. Russian by birth, American by music. That's how some describe New York jazz vocalist Svetlana. Along with the Delancey Five, she's recently put out her latest album called A Night at the Movies. It's a compilation of film classics with appearances by special guests like Wycliffe Gordon. Svetlana and I recently met in Manhattan to talk about the album and how her music has brought her family closer together. Speaking of family, Svetlana begins the conversation with how she grew up in Russia.
I grew up in a very happy child in a wonderful family of engineers, and everybody was an engineer. My grandma was an engineer, the chief engineer on the fish processing plant. My father was an engineer in a science research institute. My mother was an engineer in a computer science institute. Everybody was an engineer. And so Russian society in that way was pretty stratified. If you were born in a particular strata of society, and mine happened to be scientists and engineers, you were more or less expected to stay there and do that for life. The only person who broke away from that was my aunt. She wanted to be an actress.
Oh.
And she was allowed to be an actress by the family only after she went and got herself a degree with honors in engineering. And then she went to study theater, acting, directing, and ended up being a chief engineer in the theater. But still to this day is fulfilling her dream of being involved in arts. But she was used as more of a negative example for me. You don't want to end up like your aunt, being artsy, but I couldn't help it. I was a very artistic child. I drew, I painted, I sang, and my parents were very loving, and they surrounded me with opportunities that enhanced that part of my life as well. I studied piano as a kid. I also spent a lot of time with my grandmother, who lived in the center of Moscow in this very particular building that Stalin, way back in the 50s and 40s, built from the example of Empire State Building and those skyscrapers in America. And some of those buildings had sort of interesting secret places that escaped the Soviet censorship. And one such place was this movie theater called The Illusionist, of all things. And that particular theater was more of a cultural center, and they were screening Disney movies, old French New Wave movies, French comedies, Italian movies that were generally not available during the Soviet times. And when I stayed with my grandma, we went to see those movies and cartoons over almost every day, and they provided this very different ray of light into the life of a Soviet child who mostly, had 3 channels of TV growing up with a lot of news and propaganda. But I kept on with music while also studying mathematics, not engineering. And because that was kind of prescribed, and then kind of slowly involved myself more and more with the arts, more as an amateur, and then I went, after I got my degree in math, to study music. And then finally an opportunity presented itself to come here to America, and that changed my life.
And you were 23 when that happened.
I was. It was in the 90s, and that's where, after the collapse of Soviet Union, it was kind of a bit of a time of chaos, early capitalism, I guess. People were grabbing property and land, and the laws of new capitalist society were being written. And for a young person, there were kind of very few options of what to do that were exciting and interesting. It was also a bit of a dangerous time in Moscow. There was a lot of crime and a lot of corruption. It didn't really cost too much to give a bribe to a police officer to make someone disappear. So I got an opportunity to come to New York to study at the New School, to study nonprofit management. So I was young, I had no ties, and my parents encouraged me to go off. And I landed in East Village, not directly, via JFK Airport. And I remember that bright August day on August 22nd, and the glass automatic doors of JFK Airport just opening up. And here I am with my old leather gigantic suitcase, inside of which my mom put this aluminum pan, because of course in America you cannot buy a frying pan like that, and then my guitar in the other hand, so I can be a life of every party. That was my father's directive.
There you go.
And just walk through those doors and kind of never look back.
Did you finish your degree for nonprofit management?
And many others. One thing you have to know about me is that I have 4 master's degrees, which is not excessive for.
I just feel so inadequate right now. I don't even have my bachelor's.
Please don't. It's not a thing. When I was graduating from Manhattan School of Music, I was running quite late to graduation, and my classmates, Curtis Noasad, Billy Test, all these wonderful, exciting players, jazz players of today, were texting me and saying, "Where the hell are you?" And I told them, "Come on, you're such amateurs. This is my 3rd graduation in Riverside Church. You never arrive on time. There are all these boring speeches." And when I walked into Riverside Church, my name tag was the only one on this giant table. And just as I walked in, we started walking up to get our diplomas. I was right there, right on time.
You've always made a grand entrance since then, I suppose.
Yes.
You finished your degrees.
Yes.
You mentioned some of the early influences, watching these American movies, being exposed to the arts. What were some of the early musicians that you heard, specifically jazz musicians, that you heard that were inspirational to you, that you thought, gee, I'd really like to, do something like that?
I mean, it will sound so stereotypical, and it was one person just because my parents happened to have had a stack of records by Ella Fitzgerald. And of course, that was because it was linked to Soviet relationship with jazz,
yes,
which in the 20s, jazz spilled out of America and made its way to Soviet Union. But as it was music of freedom, Soviet regime didn't like it so much. There were slogans such as, "Today you're playing jazz, and tomorrow you will sell your motherland." However, during the Second World War, there were a lot of bands going around entertaining the troops. So anything was up for grabs, and jazz really gained prominence. And then during the Cold War, after the Second World War, towards the 60s and 70s, there was a U.S. Department cultural ambassador program, and Louis Armstrong was part of it, and Ella Fitzgerald. And so Melodia, which is translated as melody, which was the only official label of the Soviets, started printing reprints of some of the Western artists to support those tours. And so Ella Fitzgerald was one of those, and we happened to have had a lot of them. And there was a turntable in the living room, and I just listened and listened and listened to her. So it was really the influence for a long, long, long time.
You're listening to In Studio from Simply Timeless. Our guest this week is Svetlana. She's just released the album Night at the Movies, a wonderful compilation of classics and even some newer tunes from films that we all know and love. And I want to talk about that album in a few moments. But let's go back to the 1990s. You've arrived here in the States, and obviously you've been in love with jazz for many years. So when is it that you started to think, this is something that I should do for more than just fun?
It is such a good question, and you don't even understand why. You're just instinctively asking the right question. I felt like this since I was a child. I was just never allowing myself, or never had the right circumstance to pursue it. to the point where people, when I was still in a different occupation as my day job, and people would say, oh, how nice you have a hobby that is music, while formally it was true, it was really like a stab in the heart. I didn't feel music was my hobby. I felt it was my life. But coming here, I pursued my degree in nonprofit management, and then through other couple of degrees, found a job doing kind of business management consulting, and a lot of travel, and just allowed me to kind of find my footing here as an immigrant with no family and no other support. But then I had family, and it kind of made me reevaluate my life a little bit. And also I took a class, an evening class in this wonderful New York institution called New York Jazz Academy. And Carolyn Leonard, who's a wonderful jazz singer, a daughter of Mr. Jay Leonard, who's a fantastic bassist, and she's a great musician in her own right. And it was a master class. And I was at least 20 to 30 years younger than everybody in this class. And there were these wonderful ladies, and they gave it their whole heart, but they were just really not great. And I looked at this, and I, without judgment, I just projected that onto my life. And I had this almost, it was like a cemetery of unrealized dreams. And I imagined myself 20 years from now just regretting that I didn't go for it. And I got such a fire in myself. And I scheduled lessons with Carolyn, and she told me, I teach a lot of students. You have the fire to do this. And that was encouraging because I had really no idea. But that's when I really very quickly made a decision to try and go for it. And go for it was just playing every gig that was in front of me, driving for 3 hours to, get paid $30. Those kind of gigs,
yes,
like it is in New York. But it was a great time. I was just obsessed with just being a musician after so many years of just kind of doing it here and there, not in a serious way. So.
I think Kat Russell, she and I interviewed one time a few months ago, and she referred to those kind of people as lifers. They're not just doing this, when they feel like it.
Exactly.
This is who they are.
Yeah.
And I love to think of music as a conversation, just as we're having right here. And you certainly bring much to the conversation. You have a very unique voice, a selection of songs that you bring, and you've worked very hard at it. Here in 2019, we have the pleasure of having listened to your album Night at the Movies. And it's a beautiful album. Very wholesome, very original treatments of these songs, I think. It starts off with a song called Moonlight. In fact, on this day, which is before the release of the album that we're recording this, you've just released the single for Moonlight. And I've got to tell you, it's from a 1995 film called Sabrina. But the treatment that you and the orchestra give on this, it's a very romantic, a very warm feeling. There are other tracks on the album, like Happy. You sing a duet with Wycliffe Gordon for that one. I thought Pharrell Williams' recording of that from a few years ago was spectacular, and then I hear your cover, and that was just phenomenal. But I think, and I'm going to be biased here, you talked about those Disney movies. I think my favorite from the entire album, though, is the duet that you have with Sullivan Fortner at the piano, When You Wish Upon a Star from Pinocchio. There are certainly some selections here that come from your childhood, as evidenced by what you said, but without getting too terribly deep, how did you put together the concept for this album? I mean, there are thousands of songs from films, but why are these 14 tracks so special to you?
I think let's get deep. I think let's really get to the crux of it. I have to really give credit in part to an amazing producer, a patient, incredible artist, and producer, producing his art, who helped throughout the entire process. His name is Matt Pearson, and he produced this record for me, and he did work with many other vocalists. But when him and I met, and I have invited him to produce this record, he said, look, there are different ways of approaching records. It can be a tribute to an artist, can be a topic, a concept. And I remember talking to him, and I said, hey, listen, I love movies. And one day after this record, I would like to make a record about movies. And he said, but why not this record? And so I said, oh, okay. And so there began a year-long process of selecting songs, which was in part directed by our schedules, but in part was really, we started maybe with 100 songs. But after we narrowed them down, what I realized that the selection had everything to do with the idea of dreaming, both in a direct sense, just loving the night and its mysteries and the moonlight and the moon river, but also the idea of dreaming as escape from your current circumstance, overcoming, persevering. And therefore it's really linked to my life and my story, where I came from. And a lot of those songs, like Over the Rainbow or Almost There, Pure Imagination, have either been written at the times that the world was overcoming something terrible, or they talk about keeping on. So all the songs at the next level, in addition to being for movies, to me are connected to this idea of dreaming. And it was a very profound realization after we did end up picking 14. But it was also, we wanted to have music from different decades. That was definitely an idea to go from, 1935, Cheek to Cheek, to an Oscar winner in 2017, Remember Me, from the movie Coco, and fill in the decades in between. So that was another kind of ways in which the songs were selected.
You were listening to In Studio. I'm your host, Jay Daniels. Our guest is Svetlana. She is the vocalist featured on her new album called Night at the Movies. You talk about dreaming, escaping. Certainly life has been a whirlwind for you over the past few years.
And hopefully the whirlwind continues.
And you even pay homage to your home in Russia with one of the tracks called No One's Home. It's from a 1975 film called Irony of Fate. And as we mentioned, there are several special moments on this album. And family has been a central part of your life, something very special for you. And there's another special moment on this album. It's a song that Nat King Cole popularized back in the mid-'50s called Smile, which comes from a Charlie Chaplin film called Modern Times. And I remember I was reviewing the album and I heard another voice on the album. Who'd you get to sing that one with?
Well, I managed to convince my teenage daughter to come on to the studio with me. And that was actually Matt's idea, because he felt and he suggested that we need to bring in all the connection, make it more personal, bring all parts of me into this recording. And certainly being a parent and being a mother is a big part of it. And the idea of bringing in a child to sing a song with me is both to underline the very timelessness of this genre, be that the music that she as a child of today, grounded in Instagrams and electronics and whatever else the teenagers today are grounded in, can still relate to, but also the movies. And the movie Modern Times is about this sweet ideas of olden times of 1930s coming away. And also it is, you can sing the song as if it's a monologue, telling it to someone, smile. But this is a conversation between me and her. And as a parent, I learn as much from her as she learns from me. And so we're talking to each other saying, smile. Even if your heart is breaking, and even if it's aching, it's going to be okay. So that conversational aspect is also kind of part of the idea with this song.
A lot of your performances are here in New York City, so you don't have to travel away from home too terribly often. But do you sometimes find that it can be hard to juggle being a mother, juggling that with your musical career? I mean, let's face it, jazz performances are late at night, and so you can't be home all the time.
Like anything in life, the consequences and the ideas have sometimes opposing manifestations. On one hand, this is a dilemma of any working parent, not just mothers, but fathers too. We yearn to be with our children yearn to be with us. Just as I left home today, my daughter gave me the biggest, hardest hug. At the same time, I think my children are proud of me. I think it gives them a model of someone being productive member of society at different levels, as a parent, as a working parent, as an artist. So I think balance is the key. And it does remain to be the most difficult job to balance both of those things. But again, I don't know that this is necessarily unique to me as a musician, or it's a dilemma of any working parent. You know, you try to work to provide, but you are away from your family as part of it. And I think especially being an artist, sometimes it feels like you are not just providing, but you're fulfilling this urge, which at times can feel selfish. Yeah. So again, it is something that you have to do on balance. I do not drive for 3 hours for $30 gig anymore, unless it's something very special. I try to have a balanced life, which gives all different parts of it a fair effort.
I looked up the meaning of your name. Okay. Almost accidentally, I was looking for your website, and I went to Google, and I typed in Svetlana, and it came up with the meaning of your name, which I always love to see the meaning of some of these names that you don't hear too often. And it means light. And I love to think of this idea of conversation that we've been talking about, whether it's between you and your daughter, someone else in your family, or with someone who hears this album. Just as music has been able to offer light to you in your life, how do you think you are able to bring light to others? And I don't want to make the world sound so terribly dark, but I will say this, people are going through a lot right now. Life is not easy. And people could use some encouragement. They could use a little positivity, something to help them along. How do you think your work as a mother and as a musician, all of that put together, how do you think that you are able to bring light to others?
In a way, in a nutshell, I think this is one of the key jobs that we have as artists, is to transform. Be that to evoke an emotion that lifts someone up, or maybe evokes a sense of sadness, but through that and reflection opens and frees something in them. So tonight, as I have mentioned, I'm playing this, show at the back room in the speakeasy, which is essentially a bar. People are there to have a good time. the work week is about to start, and if they have left uplifted, the job is done. And you are trying to do it by being your authentic self as much as you can, connecting with people and their feelings of the bandstand and connecting with your band members. I think that's the job, really.
Do you find it hard sometimes on stage to be yourself?
I try. I think in a way, sometimes it's easy to fall into a service role, as in, okay, I'm here to entertain, let me do that. And I think that is great, but the deeper impact and the deeper connection is if you can both entertain and move, and you can do it probably the most if you're the most authentic self. That's what people stop and listen to. That's what people say, oh, what just hit me? So I think that's the goal, and the job never ends, You always feel, you don't want to think about it too much. You just want to go in, jump in, and try your best, but I don't know that you ever feel fully satisfied. Oh, I have really done it this time, and that's now I have a badge that I never have to work again, just like any other job.
So why music?
I wouldn't be happy doing anything else, because through music, I'm able to experience such emotions and invoke such emotions that I'm not able to do with any other job. And I have tried. I've had many other jobs before. I can say in confidence, having earned my 4 different graduate degrees and worked, as a teacher of mathematics, as a business consultant, as a market researcher, as a professor. I've gotten to be good at those jobs, but that feeling of kind of connection that I experience with music, that's why. It's just like a drug. You can't have enough.
A wonderful interview with our friend Svetlana. Be sure and check out her new album, A Night at the Movies. For more information on her tour schedule, visit SvetlanaJazz.com. Our thanks to Lydia Liebman for her help in making this interview possible. Until we meet again, I'm Jay Daniels, thanking you for joining us in studio.